Virgil stood in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of water, when a soft scratching at the back door drew his attention. It was just after 2 a.m, and the rain that had been falling steadily all day now lashed the windows intensely, so it was unlikely that any of the other sides were responsible for the noise. Giving into his confusion and curiosity, he decided to investigate, and what he saw when he turned on the porch light caught him off guard. A small black kitten stood on the other side of the glass, shivering as water dripped from its fur and whiskers, looking as if it were hardly old enough to be away from its mother. Sliding the door out of the way, he was unsure of what to do as it mewled up at him helplessly. It timidly placed a paw in the threshold, and his heart shattered. He couldn't leave the poor thing outside in such horrible weather. Ignoring the wetness that seeped through his jacket, he gently took the tiny animal up in his arms. She was extremely frail, and he was only saddened further as it nuzzled close to him. Glancing around the yard, sympathy crashed over him like a tsunami. The cat was completely alone, with no mother or siblings to be seen. Holding the trembling feline close, anxiety locked the door before heading to his corner of the mind palace. Taking the hand towel from his bathroom, he began drying her off. She was so diminutive, he was afraid he would hurt her. Eventually, he succeeded in getting as much of the water from her pelt as he could, and he tried wrapping her in a blanket to warm her. That didn't last long, however, because the moment he sat back down on the bed, she pulled free of the fabric and curled up in his lap. She gazed up at Virgil with bright green eyes that almost looked as if she was trying to thank him in some way. Settling down, she placed her muzzle on his right arm, and in that instant he knew there was no way he was going to be able to let her go. She'd only been in his life for 15 minutes, and yet he already cared for her as if she had been his pet for years. A connection forged through previous heartache, of how it felt to be alone, lost in the dark. He wanted to do everything in his power to give her the same second chance that he had been granted. Having made up his mind, the next step was to find her a name, and with her sleek black fur, something like Fluffy or Whiskers just didn't seem to fit. Careful so as not to disturb the kitten, which was now purring softly, the gloomy aspect pulled out his phone. For half an hour he scoured through pages on Google, trying to find a label that was dark but not morbid, a task that proved harder than expected. He had almost decided on Morticia from the Addams Family, until he found Amaya, and he knew that was the right one. Basquet, a mix of Spanish and French, it meant night rain, and with a definition like that, he knew he would never forget why he had rescued the small animal that reminded him so much of himself. Putting the device away, he stroked the fur between her ears, his voice a delicate whisper. "You have a home now, Amaya." At the last word, she blinked up at him like she already knew that was her name. Virgil woke the next morning to something tapping his head lightly. Barely opening his eyes, he was momentarily confused as to why there was a cat in his room. A smile graced his lips as he remembered the events from the night before. The kitten had her hind paws on his chest, and one of her forepaws on his shoulder, while the other swatted playfully at his bangs. Suddenly, it felt like she knew he had awoken, because she just stopped and gazed at him curiously, her head tilted to one side. After a few seconds, instead of continuing to play with his hair, she took her paw and simply rested it on his nose, and it was all he could do not to start laughing. He played with her for a while, but without warning she jumped up onto his shoulders, draping herself around the back of his neck. She was so tiny that her nose was visible on one shoulder, and only the tip of her tail on the other. Anxiety held still, worried that if he moved he would frighten her, or worse, she would fall and get hurt. As he became a little more comfortable, he slowly extended his arm and rested his hand on the blankets. Amaya glanced at it, and as if it were a bridge, she walked down it clumsily and sat on the bed. Virgil couldn't help but grin. "I think you just learned your first trick, little one." She laid down, resting her head on his lap, looking up at him almost as if she were proud of herself. "I think it's time we got you a few things." Waving his hand over the pillow, a small collar appeared. It was made of a deep purple material, and the tag that hung from it was the shape of his symbol, with her name, Amaya, engraved in the cloud, and Sanders on the lightning bolt. She sniffed at it cautiously before allowing him to fasten it around her neck, the violet bringing out her eyes. Purple and green do seem to go together. With another wave of his hand, food and water bowls, toys, and a bunch of other cat stuff materialized near the door of the closet. Taking the kitten in his hands, he gently placed her on the floor, and at first she stayed close to the bed, but soon enough she was running around so fast that he could barely keep his eyes on her. She would stop here and there to look around or to explore, jumping up into chairs and looking over at him as if she had accomplished some mighty feat. Sometimes she would start to play with something dangerous or fragile, and Virgil would simply move it out of her reach, doing his best to kitten-proof the area. Unaware of how much time had passed, knocking echoed through the room, followed by Patton's cheerful tone. "Breakfast in 5 minutes, kiddo!" "Okay." Virgil didn't raise his voice much, since the sounds had startled the kitten, which had run into the closet. Now her green eyes were the only thing visible against the darkness as they glittered with fear. The receding footsteps in the corridor told him that Morality had made his way downstairs, so he slowly walked towards the closet. Lying down on his stomach, the small feline poked her nose out of the shadows and sniffed at him tentatively. "Seems like I'm not the only one who gets frightened by loud noises in the presence of others." His voice was hardly more than a whisper. "It's safe, though, I promise." Extending his arm in the same fashion he had previously, Amaya climbed up onto his shoulders, and he slowly rose to his feet. Something tickled his left ear, and from a glance in the mirror, he could just barely see the white teeth that nibbled at him. Laughing lightly under his breath, Anxiety took her carefully from around his neck and placed her in the bed that had appeared with her food and water bowls. "I never thought I'd say this about anything, but you are adorable." Smiling, he started for the door, but more than once he had to return as the kitten tried to follow after him. "You have to stay here and get some rest, little one. I'll be back soon." Making his way down the steps, a thought tugged at him. What was he going to tell the others? Even though he had a particular fondness for them, Morality was allergic to cats. Thankfully, it wasn't a life-or-death reaction, but other than that, he had no idea how his companions would feel about him taking on a pet. Anxiety had made up his mind even before he reached the kitchen. At least for the time being, he wasn't going to tell the others about Amaya. She was still jumpy, even with just him around, and it wasn't unwarranted. She was so young, and yet she'd already been through so much more than most cats her age. The idea actually caused worry to chill his blood like ice. How would she fare in his room alone? She was only a kitten after all. He shook his head to clear his mind as he reached the table, glad that he wasn't the last to join. Roman was still absent, and that would ward off the suspicions the others would have otherwise. Taking a sip of his coffee, he waited in silence for the conversation to start up, and it wasn't long before Patton spoke. "How are your nights, kiddos?" He sounded a bit more nasal than usual, but Logan didn't seem to notice as he trained his eyes on his own source of caffeine. "I had a decent evening. I went to bed late due to all the work I had to finish, but other than that it was pleasant." "What about you, Virgil?" "My night was pretty normal, so I guess it was good." The events had been anything but normal, but he wasn't lying in regards to how well his night had gone. "So, you didn't get much sleep Achoo! He and Logic both jumped at the loud sneeze. "Sorry about that. I woke up with a stuffy nose. I hope I'm not getting sick." Anxiety fought down a wince. He was going to have to be more careful. Changing his clothes before meeting with the others and doing all of his own laundry. He sighed internally as he realized that keeping his secret was going to be a lot harder than he had expected, but it would be worth it as long as he got to keep the kitten. The thought spurred him onwards, and he quickly regained his usual disinterested demeanor, but he was still grateful that any attention that may have been placed on him was taken by the appearance of the prince. "Morning, all." The words were spoken with his usual flamboyant nature. "Hey, kiddo, how was your night?" Morality was washing his hands after the violent sneeze only moments before, but he sounded as upbeat as ever. The new arrival cast a concerned glance in the direction of the one who had spoken. "Are you feeling okay? You sound like you might be coming down with a cold." "I think I'm okay, son. This feels more like allergies than anything else. Although, I don't know what could be causing them." Drying his hands, he took the seat furthest from anxiety, which helped to ease his nerves. Logan was quick to respond. "I still think it would be wise if you got some rest after breakfast. Even if you are well, allergies will make you more susceptible to illness." There was a look of defeat about the father figure, but he nodded in agreement as he reached for the bacon on his plate. "If it'll make you guys feel better, I'll rest a bit more after I do the dishes." The fight-or-flight reflex ate his pancakes in silence, only half listening to the inane banter that filled the air. No matter what he did, he couldn't stop thinking about the tiny feline in his room, and how he was going to be able to hide her, at least for a time. Despite the challenges that lay ahead, he wasn't going to give up on her. She deserved a home where she could feel safe. If he could get a second chance after everything that he had done, then she had the right to one too. Once they were done with breakfast, Logan convinced Patton to let him clean up so he could get some sleep. Meanwhile, Roman settled in the commons to sort through some of his first draft ideas, and Virgil escaped back to his room. When he got there, he realized he was facing the first of what would surely be many large challenges as a pet owner. In his absence, the kitten had managed more destruction than he would have thought her tiny body was capable of. The base of the curtains had been shredded. She'd knocked over both her food and water dishes, and one of his pictures lay on the floor with a shattered frame. Then, judging from the black paw prints all over the carpet, she had at some point found her way into his eyeshadow. It was clear to him that until he had trained her, the tiny puff of fur zipping around his room was going to be a little terror, but he still felt his heart soar when she came bounding up to him. Thankfully, he'd looked up some training tips online the night before, so at least he had some idea of how he was going to handle the situation as he looked down at her. "I was only gone for 20 minutes, Amaya. How did you manage all this?" Similar to the way he had made her collar and toys appear, Virgil was able to clean up the mess with a snap of his fingers. That would be the sound he would use to condition the feline into knowing she had done something he hadn't approved of, and he would use that to deter her in the future. At the click of his fingers, each item that had been broken or mess that had been made reverted back to the state they had been in when he had left. The curtains sewed themselves back together, the claw marks on the bed frame disappeared, and he put her scratching post in front of it so that she would claw that instead. Next, the mess from her bowls cleared up, and they refilled themselves with fresh food and water. The paw prints of makeup vanished, and the shattered frame mended itself. As he went to put the fallen picture onto a higher shelf, he couldn't help but smile. It was a reminder of his own second chance. Behind the glass was the card that morality had given him after the video in which anxiety had finally revealed his name. Once it was in its place, he knelt down and extended his arm, and soon enough he had a purring kitten draped over his shoulders. It had been nearly 6 months since Virgil had rescued Amaya, and she was a little over half-grown. She still loved to play and get into trouble, but the snapping trick had worked, and now, whenever he clicked his fingers, she would stop what she was doing and look up at him, almost apologetically. The black cat would remain like that and keep her gaze locked on him until he whistled through his teeth, which was the sound he'd used for positive reinforcement. Anxiety was amazed that he'd managed to keep the secret for so long. He'd never intended to do so, but even once Amaya had become less afraid of him, whenever he thought about telling the others, he worried that they would force him to give her up. The allergy attack that Patton had had the morning after he'd found the kitten had made him mindful. Any clothes that he wore when he played with her, he made care to wash himself, and upon returning to his room, he would take off his jacket and hang it on the back of the door. He liked it so much that he worried it would fall apart if it had to be washed too often, so that was one of the things the kitten was not allowed to mess with. It was fortuitous that the others didn't often visit his room, but when Virgil left, it became obvious that he wasn't the only fearful one. A quick Google search one night when Amaya wouldn't leave his side after a long day of filming told him that she had separation anxiety, which meant when she was left alone for extended periods of time, she would fear that he was never coming back, and that often resulted in the destruction of his curtains, a blanket, a pillow, or her bed. It was something he was still working on with her, but she wasn't even fully grown yet, so for her age, she was pretty well trained. She had also gained a healthy amount of weight and no longer looked like a walking skeleton. Currently, Anxiety was getting ready to join the others in the common room for a movie night. He had just touched up his eyeshadow and was heading to grab his coat before Amaya ran up to him. He scratched the fur under her chin for a few moments, wishing he could stay in his corner of the mindscape with her, but the others had been fairly adamant about him not being able to get out of the activity. Eventually, he stood, heading to the bathroom to wash his hands. When he returned, he put on his jacket and opened the door, but before he could do anything, Amaya hurried out of his room and into the hall. Patton was especially excited for the movie night this week, because they had actually convinced Virgil to join them. He'd finally finished Season 7 of Doctor Who, and Logan had insisted they watched The Day of the Doctor together. He was looking forward to watching the 2-hour special, but more so to the time they would be spending together as a family that wasn't focused on fixing an issue in Thomas's life. 2 bowls of popcorn in his hand, Morality went to join the logical and creative sides in the Commons. But just as he set them on the coffee table, however, his nose and eyes began to itch. Turning to tell the others he was going to get some Benadryl, they all froze when a streak of black ran down the steps. Only once it had come to an abrupt halt in front of them did he understand his allergic reaction, because what stood before them now was a solid black kitten that couldn't be more than 6 months old, its green eyes glittering with fear. The alarm that had its fur on end was a clear sign that it probably wasn't too used to being around people. The rare use of a confused inflection to Logic's voice tore him from his thoughts. A cat? Where did it come from? Upstairs. The singular word from the prince elicited a scoff from the intellectual, but neither had noticed the crucial detail hidden in the fur on the cat's neck. Obviously, but how did it get up there? Even though his nose was stopped up, the moral side spoke before Roman had a chance to respond. You both always act like you know all the answers, so it's surprising you keep overlooking something so simple. Logan straightened his glasses as he looked away from the kitten. And what might that be? Patton couldn't help but giggle as he formulated the answer. Take a second to really think about it. It's a black cat. He paused, meeting the befuddled looks that the others wore. With a purple collar. And the most important thing? Her tag is shaped like a storm cloud with a lightning bolt. It all seems pretty obvious to me. They were only able to gaze down at her for a moment before a familiar voice echoed from the second floor. Amaya! At what must have been her name, she whirled around and darted back the way she had come, and without thinking, the others followed closely in her wake. When they reached a point on the stairs in which they could see the corridor, they all stopped. Virgil stood with his back to them, and for some reason snapped his fingers. The kitten straightened up immediately and looked directly at him while the 3 of them watched on in silence. I thought you knew better than that, Amaya. At the end of his statement, the fight-or-flight reflex knelt down and extended one arm so that his hand was just in front of the small feline. They stayed like that for a brief moment before their friend whistled through his teeth, and it was all Morality could do to stay quiet. At the sound, the kitten walked up his arm and draped herself around his shoulders before he stood and walked back into his room, the door closing softly behind them. Anxiety put Amaya down as soon as he closed the door. There was no way he was going to be able to keep his secret now. The kitten meowed at him like she was trying to apologize, and he knew he couldn't stay mad, but the others had to have seen her. It was only a matter of time now until they put the pieces together, if they hadn't already, and figured out that she was his pet. Worry coursed through him like fire. Would they want him to get rid of her? Would they force him to? Unable to bear the thought of losing her so soon, he realized in that moment that he was actually willing to beg to be allowed to keep Amaya. He sat down on his bed, putting his head in his hands, and it wasn't long before the kitten jumped up and laid down next to him, resting her muzzle on his arm the way she had the night he found her. Try as he might, he couldn't find the willpower to leave the small feline to go join the others, seeing as it could very well be the last night he would be able to spend with her. If he were to go downstairs now, at best he would be asked a barrage of questions he wasn't sure he could answer, and at worst, no. He wasn't a child. The fight-or-flight reflex was perfectly capable of making decisions for himself. Amaya hadn't become an issue yet, and he could train her to stay in his room, so there was no reason he should give her up. He wasn't going to give her up. They were not going to take her away from him. The sound of footsteps in the hall betrayed the presence of the other three before knocking rang through the room. The noise scared the timid cat into the closet, which for the moment was probably the safest place for her. Virgil considered waving all of her toys and bowls out of existence for the time being, but there was no point. Instead, with a flick of his wrist, they all arranged themselves into neat piles and rows. Opening the door, he was shocked to see the concerned expressions that his companions wore. But Patton was the first to speak.
"We thought you were going to join us for movie night. Are you okay, kiddo? You look like you're on the brink of tears."
Anxiety didn't know how to respond at first. The truth was, until he knew what the others thought, he wasn't okay. His voice ended up coming out as a low growl, and a bit more defensive than he had intended. "Don't try and distract me from the issue." He paused, but opted not to change his tone. "I don't care what any of you think. You're not going to take her away from me." They all looked confused, but to his surprise, it was Princey who seemed to come to the realization of what was happening first, and stepped forward. "I think I know what all this is about." His gaze and voice softened as he continued. "Virgil, no one is going to try and take that little black kitten away from you. Her name is Amaya." "Wait, you aren't?" He suddenly felt bad for choosing to react with anger so quickly, because they were saying the one thing he hadn't expected to hear. Patton moved back to the front.
"Of course not, son. We only saw her for a moment, but from what we did see, she seemed to be well taken care of."
He glanced into the room before returning his gaze to Virgil.
"And the last thing we would want to do is take away something you so clearly care about. Or in this case, who you consider to be a member of the family."
His head shot up at the last word, and he was amazed to see the others nodding in agreement, but it was Logan who broke the silence next. "I expected one of us to get a pet eventually, although I always assumed it would be Patton." The one in question giggled.
"I always thought it would be me too, but life is full of surprises."
He paused, smiling at the fight-or-flight reflex.
"So where is this little kitten of yours? I think after all this, it's time we met her."
He gazed at his friend in confusion. "But your allergies." Morality gave him a knowing look and pulled a small bottle from his pocket.
"Benadryl can work wonders, kiddo."
Virgil actually dared to let a smile grace his lips. "Well, before I get her, you guys need to know she's pretty shy. She's never even been out of my room until today. So you guys will have to come in. I'll make sure to have you step into the hall whenever I notice the eyeshadow, though." Each of them gave their forms of agreement, so he let them in, and they waited patiently by his desk while he walked over to the closet. Kneeling down and whistling through his teeth, the small animal stepped out warily. Clearly, she felt safer on his shoulders as she quickly climbed his arm. Moving back towards his colleagues, he felt her stiffen, so he whistled again before addressing the others. "This is Amaya. She's not used to people, so you need to be quiet and gentle with her." He stroked the fur between her ears. "It would also be best if you stepped forward one at a time to greet her for the first time." After a few moments of silence, Morality slowly moved forward, anxiety whistling through his teeth before speaking in a gentle tone. "Hold your hand out and let her sniff you. I'll nod to you when it's okay to pet her." Gently, he held out his hand to Amaya, who glanced at the fight-or-flight reflex. He whistled softly, and she turned back to Patton. He whistled again as she sniffed his fingers, and when she moved her head back, he nodded to the father figure. He tenderly scratched under her chin, and she extended her neck, purring as she did so. Patton's eyes glittered with joy, but his voice was a reserved whisper.
"Aw, you're so cute, little one. Welcome to the family."
After a few more moments, he stepped back and was replaced by Logan. Anxiety repeated the process with him, whistling with each step, so Amaya would have something positive to associate his friends with. She took to logic as quickly as she had taken to morality, purring softly as he petted the fur between her ears. When he spoke, there was a sense of compassion that he hadn't expected to hear in the voice of the scholar. "You are just too precious to process, Amaya." Then, with a final pat between the ears, he too moved back. Roman took his place, following the same steps, and the kitten came to trust him just as she had with the other two. She nuzzled his hand when he paused, as if he were afraid he'd scare her. But it wasn't long before he too was petting her with a gentle touch. Princey spoke quietly, still giving Virgil the feeling that he was worried about frightening her, more than likely the effect his room was having. "You are a majestic little thing, Amaya. I'm proud to call you family." Aware of the fear that had come over the other three from the exposure to his corner of the Mind Palace, anxiety sent them into the corridor briefly. When they came back in, the feline didn't even flinch. Instead, she watched them curiously, a good sign that she was beginning to trust them further. When Virgil motioned for them to sit down, Amaya slowly stood from her place on his shoulders and jumped down onto the bed. She looked over his colleagues before glancing at him, as if asking permission to go and greet them. When he nodded and whistled through his teeth, she climbed off the bed and scampered up to them. Making his way to join the others, he noticed that the prince seemed the most comfortable with the feline now, which gave him an idea. "Roman, place your hand on the floor with your arms straight and elbow locked." Though he gave the fight-or-flight reflex a strange glance, he did as he was told, and within 30 seconds, Amaya was draped around his shoulders. "Well, hello to you too." Laughter filled his tone as the white teeth nibbled at his ear painlessly, and for her trick, anxiety whistled once more. Logan was finally able to look away and addressed the pet owner. "Pray tell, why do you keep making that noise?" "You mean the whistling thing?" He nodded in confirmation to the query. "Oh, it's a trick I found. You can't train a cat the same way you would a dog. They don't take well to normal teaching methods. So you use sounds. For example, I whistle when I feed her or give her treats. That way, when she does something I approve of, such as jumping up onto my shoulders, I do the same, so that she can associate the sound with positive things. That's why I whistled when each of you stepped forward. It helps her to know that I trust you, so by extension, she can trust you as well." He watched as Amaya walked back down Princey's arm and onto Morality's shoulders, so he made the noise once more before continuing. "Alternatively, since I have to snap my fingers to clean up any messes she makes or items she's broken, I use that sound to deter her from actions I disapprove of. I'll snap my fingers if she jumps up on my desk or if she starts to try and play with my hoodie. I'm still working with her on a few things, but the tactic has worked, and I chose that one because it's simple, easy to be consistent with, and it's humane." Logic looked impressed at his words. "I never would have thought of that. But now that you've explained, it does make sense." Virgil called Amaya over to him so the others could step into the hall again to take a breath of fresh air. He couldn't help but smile as they walked back in. Before he could even finish his whistle, the kitten had run up to them excitedly, and he made a point to bring that to their attention as they sat back down. "It looks to me like she's really starting to trust you guys." Roman chuckled as she scrambled over his knees to get to Patton, who had called for her. "Answer me this. How did you find Amaya in the first place?" His heart broke as he thought back to the night he had rescued her. It's a cliché opening to a story, but it was a dreary night. Rain had been pouring down all day, and after you guys went to bed, I had gone downstairs to get a glass of water. I heard scratching at the back door, and when I looked out, she was standing there, soaking wet and thin as a skeleton. I didn't see any other kittens or a mother. Then when she placed one paw in the door, almost like she was asking my permission to enter. His tone must have changed before he trailed off, because Princey responded in a joking manner. "Are those tears in your eyes, Hot Topic?" "Maybe they are, Sir Sing-a-Lot." He took a deep breath to steady his voice. "If you had seen her that night, you'd be teary too. Anyway, after that I picked her up and brought her here. I dried her off and tried to wrap her in a blanket so she could warm up, but as soon as I sat down on the bed, she came over and curled up in my lap. I knew then I wasn't going to be able to give her up. He wondered whether or not to continue, but decided he should. She deserved the same second chance I was given. Patton gave him a saddened look.
How do you mean, son?
Anxiety stared at the carpet. She was alone, lost in the dark, just like I was before you all accepted me. He fell silent for a moment, and revealing my name was a big leap that helped to lead me in the right direction, to becoming a part of the family. That thought was the reason I named her Amaya. It's not your usual pet name, but she needed a title that was representative. Amaya is Basque in origin. It means night rain, which will always remind me of how I found her, and why I took her in. Even though it had been in conversation, the loving feline had recognized not only that her name had been said, but who had said it. She quickly jumped off Morality's lap and was now nuzzling Virgil's hand. Laying it on the floor in front of her, she climbed up onto his shoulders, her loud purring nearly bringing him to tears.
She may trust us, but there's no doubt that she knows who rescued her.
The voice of the father figure had lost most of its nasal edge, and was filled with compassion, but he took on a playful nature as well.
Please tell me if I'm right. You've had Amaya for almost 6 months, haven't you?
Virgil wasn't the only one who was shocked, as he recognized the confusion that glittered in the eyes of the logical and creative sides. How could you have possibly known that? I did everything I could to try and keep that secret.
I think some of your steps to keep said secret was what gave it away, such as doing all your own laundry.
Of course Patton had caught on to that. He was the one who normally did the mundane house chores, and the fact that he was washing his own clothes would have been as much of a tip-off as the alternative.
That's not to mention I had an allergy attack that morning, and I'm only allergic to one thing, kiddo. Cats.
He nodded in response, and the movie night was put on hold as each of them decided they would rather spend the evening with their newest family member. It had been 3 months since the others had discovered Amaya. She was now allowed to freely roam the mindscape, and Anxiety's companions had begun using his sound technique to make sure she didn't get out of hand when he wasn't around. They all played their part in taking care of her, but in some ways, she took care of them too, seeming to know each time one of them was upset. When that was the case, she never failed to stop what she was doing and go sit with the one who needed her presence until they felt better. Despite all of that, however, she still spent most of her time with the fight-or-flight reflex, and still only felt safe enough in his room to sleep. Everyone may have been working together to watch over her, but there was no doubt in any of their minds that Amaya was Virgil's pet.